So there's a YouTube channel called Arly who came out with a video recently denouncing Tankies slash Marxist-Leninists, and naturally I felt the need to respond. Now the video is called Marxist-Leninist slash Tankies, a quick response, and just so you'll be able to reference it, I'll give a link to it in the description. So I highly recommend, if you feel like punishing yourself, everyone go watch this video. It will make you want to blow your brains out. So, in other words, liberals will often compare various extremist ideologies with one another, despite these ideologies being diametrically opposed to each other, both conceptually and historically. But one may ask themselves, why are people being drawn towards these extreme ideologies? Well, examining American society, we're witnessing a shift towards the center-left and the far-right because of the absolute failure of neoliberalism to answer the issues plaguing the typical worker today. Issues like climate change, wealth inequality, imperialism, and corruption, they're widespread within the system. Often the average American feels like they have zero influence in governmental policy, and that their vote is between two pre-selected puppets of the elite. Now, who the elite are varies from one's political view. Conservatives blame the Jews, George Soros, and the Illuminati slash the Bilderbergs. And their solution to this is to promote baseless misinformation and conspiracy theories with no evidence. This often serves to reinforce the bourgeois establishment by promoting propaganda in favor of capitalism under the guise of free speech and liberty, and of course a myriad of other conservative buzzwords out there. And to this end, liberals are almost just as bad. They blame big business and greedy corporations and corrupt politicians, but what are their solutions? They take over the system from within by pushing progressive candidates in bourgeois elections. They just assume they won't be bought out or corrupted, and somehow these progressive politicians manage to defeat the bourgeois establishment in elections. This of course is assuming the bourgeois don't cheat, which they will, and that the bourgeois media won't constantly decry any attempt to challenge neoliberal hegemony. In short, liberal solutions are worthless and they're doomed to fail and opportunist by nature. Any temporary gains can be easily reversed because the society is still under the control of the elites. But finally, it's time to describe what Marxist-Leninists mean by elite. It is an objective fact, not a conspiracy, that our society is under control of the bourgeoisie. It is a fact that the bourgeoisie use their power, their wealth, and their influence to bribe politicians, control elections, and buy out the media. They also use this power to hoard the means of production in a society. It is a fact that the US government commits acts of imperialist aggression all over the world on behalf of the bourgeoisie, and it is a fact that the vast majority of people living in the United States have no influence on the decisions made in Washington, that America is a pay-to-win scam which excludes the overwhelming number of people, the politically disenfranchised working class. And, of course, it is also a fact that this class struggle is directly perpetuated by the material conditions of a society. The struggle between the workers and the capitalists is a struggle over the productive forces. It is a material struggle and can be analyzed through a historical materialist viewpoint. This is all to say that this is a far cry from the philosophy of fascism, the other political extreme, which is it's a bastardized, unholy conglomeration of eugenics, toxic masculinity, social Darwinism, and bigotry. Fascism is in no way, shape, or form related to Marxism-Leninism, either ideologically or historically, outside of the fact that it was the Marxist-Leninists who crushed fascism. So why is this comparison so often made? Arly's comparison is that Tankies are basically akin to Holocaust deniers because we don't believe the Western narrative about the Ukrainian famine or lies about Stalin. In the same way that a Nazi denies the Holocaust and worships Hitler, apparently. This is a very common yet very misleading allegation towards Tankies. First of all, the Holocaust has mountains and mountains of evidence to support it. Documentation, photographs, videos, eyewitnesses, survivors, etc. But the common Western narrative that we're taught about the USSR is riddled with anti-communist propaganda from the CIA, the Hoover Institution, and right-wing think tanks. Yet, liberals will cite even the most extreme anti-communist authors without even a shred of investigation into the obvious biases these sources have. Arly provides many Wikipedia links in his video. Now, for laughs, let's try following some of these links and see which sources are cited. The Black Book of Communism, the Hoover Institute, the CIA, William Randolph Hearst, Stephen Kotkin, and Robert Conquest. Very objective. So, in addition to comparing us to Holocaust deniers, he also says we advocate for genocide. Now let's think about that word genocide. Now when I think about genocide, I think about a deliberate attempt to wipe out an entire ethnic group of people. The Marxist-Leninists want a socialist revolution in which the bourgeois class are dethroned from their seat of power. The bourgeois state is smashed and the bourgeois class is suppressed under the proletarian dictatorship. At no point in this process is it necessary to kill the entire bourgeois class. They simply must be removed from power, and once the means of production are controlled by the working class, the bourgeois will cease to be. So to call the overthrow of capitalism genocide is very much like calling the abolition of slavery genocide against white Southerners. Of course, if it were possible to have a peaceful, bloodless revolution, we would want that. Who wouldn't want that? But the bourgeois are greedy, and they have the army, they have the police, and they have the entire state apparatus. But, like the overthrow of slavery, the overthrow of capitalism is absolutely justified because it is a liberatory struggle to free the masses from bondage. To think that I even have to explain this makes me cringe. This is nothing of the millions of people who die every year as a result of capitalism. Who cries for them? Certainly not the liberals. Certainly not Arly. But it's still too much for Arly to even slightly defend the Soviet Union. Even saying the Western narrative is slightly flawed is enough to be compared to Holocaust-denying Nazi scum. Apparently, we're all murderous maniacs who want to kill anyone and everyone who disagrees with us, and it becomes hilarious to see the liberal compare the bourgeois to targeted victims of the Nazis. According to liberals, the bourgeois are a marginalized and victimized group who need to be protected from the evil Tankies. This is a foolish attempt to equate class consciousness with racism, and such a stupid and ill-conceived notion can only come from the mind of a lib. To make matters even cringier, Arly goes on to equate Nazi message boards on 4chan to the entire breadth and scope of Marxist-Leninist theory, as if this booger-eating shitlib has ever come close to reading a book by Marx or Engels. Apparently both of these methods are methods by which normies get indoctrinated into these sinister extremist ideologies. Essentially, it's only a matter of time before Arly goes on a book burning spree because dialectical and historical materialism are basically the left equivalent to Pepe the Frog memes. So here we see a common event, a common occurrence. A lib goes on an ill-informed rant equating Tankies to Nazis, citing bourgeois propaganda, the whole 9 yards. We've been down this road before. He refuses to acknowledge any bias and just mindlessly regurgitates anti-communist talking points. Good job! Really top-level research. Another lib take is to somehow say that Marxist-Leninists aren't true communists. So, this lets Arly get away with insulting communists while pretending he's not. This isn't clever or original, and all these libs do the same thing. And I'm getting really tired of it. Keep this in mind. When bootlicking goobers like this insult Marxist-Leninists or Tankies, they're insulting a group of people who want to liberate the great masses of the working class from capitalist oppression. He's taking all their contributions, all their sacrifices, all of their efforts, and disregarding it because, ew, it treats rich people badly. Spare me these crocodile tears for the capitalists. Stop insulting Holocaust victims by equating the struggle to liberate the workers with the pain and suffering inflicted on them by the Nazis. Many of the victims of the Nazi regime were communists, so stop using the deaths, their deaths in particular, to slander communism. Frankly, it's disgusting and deplorable. And you all know that I'm down to discuss and debate folks about this stuff. Obviously, I don't believe the USSR and Stalin were perfect, but I guess I'm literally no better than a Nazi because I don't believe the Hoover Institute. How do you even begin to address this? It's such a bad faith argument, a deliberate, snake-like attempt to attack communism using obviously biased sources and straw-manned claims. Speaking of straw-men, Arly then claims that you can't support LGBT rights or be against racism if you're a Marxist-Leninist because the USSR persecuted gay people and sent ethnic minorities to concentration camps, apparently. Now keep in mind that almost no Marxist-Leninist I've ever interacted with thinks that gays or non-whites should be persecuted. Also keep in mind that the Party of Communists has an entire commission dedicated towards LGBT rights and another one dedicated towards oppressed nationalities. Another thing to note is that the USSR was one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world, and that they openly embraced their multiculturalism. In the same country you had Russians, Turks, Mongols, Siberians, and numerous other nationalities all living side by side. The USSR certainly put the United States to shame in terms of its progressive attitude towards race. As far as the treatment of LGBT people, historically every country in the world at that time persecuted gay people. So is it really fair in this argument to single out the USSR? I mean, after all, I'm sure gay people in America in the 1940s had no problems at all. I'm also sure America would never do something so horrible as genocide or mass enslavement or putting people in concentration camps. Obviously, anti-LGBT policies in these countries were the norm at the time, and because of that, they were products of the time. Contemporary Marxist-Leninists that I've interacted with have been overwhelmingly supportive of marginalized communities, including the LGBT community. Once again, this is another liberal straw man. Arly then argues that you're not allowed this one's my favorite. You're apparently not allowed to cite the deaths from capitalism and imperialism, which number in the millions per year, because, quote, that's deflection. So, I guess we should all pack it up, comrades. I mean, after all, if we're not allowed to talk about how many millions of people capitalism has killed and continues to kill, what's the point anymore? I mean, apparently, imperialism is irrelevant and had zero effect on the actions taken by communist regimes. And then, he hilariously claims that Tankies don't understand what capitalism is. Says the person who thinks that Marxism-Leninism theory is the same as 4chan memes. He then argues, and this is where it gets absurd, he then argues that the Native American genocide and other imperialist atrocities weren't the fault of capitalism. I'm sure there was zero economic motive for the US government to kick all the Cherokee out of Tennessee, for example. It couldn't have been because the Cherokee had good land. Arly says that the Native American genocide was imperialism, but not capitalism. Hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. This guy somehow thinks imperialism isn't capitalism. He then goes on to define imperialism in such a loose way that he says literally every single country on earth has been imperialistic. Apparently even the USSR and Maoist China. Claims of a Soviet imperialism reveal the true ignorance of liberals. Obviously, to anyone who's read theory, we know that imperialism is the inevitable result of monopoly capital. And so the question arises, how can you have imperialism without capital? You can't. So what Arly seems to call imperialism could also be called the proletarian revolution by people who actually read books. So I guess part of this Soviet imperialism was the defeat of Nazi Germany. But once again, folks, we're not allowed to give the USSR credit for that because, quote, they were evil too. So Arly then says he's glad that the United States eventually crushed the USSR because it was one of the most, quote, evil regimes in history. Again, zero irony, seeing as the US has committed actual genocide, had and still has concentration camps, had and still has massive race problems, LGBT discrimination against women, and has, of course, enslaved an entire race of people. You see, folks, in Vietnam, in the War of Vietnam, America, we were actually the good guys. We were trying to fight the evil Tankies to prevent genocide. So that's why we dropped Agent Orange on them. So, to conclude, this guy doesn't understand what genocide is. He doesn't understand what imperialism is, what capitalism is, or what communism is. He thinks Tankies don't have functioning brains, but clearly mine is more functioning than his, considering his entire argument falls apart under even the slightest bit of examination. Oh, and just to top it off, he has a video where he says Joe Biden is more progressive than Bernie Sanders. So let that sink in.
And progressivism is definitely not only democratic socialism. Joe Biden's policies fulfill the ideas and goals of progressivism just as much, if not more, than Bernie Sanders' policies in those ways.
You heard it here first, folks.